Okay, welcome everybody to our October webinar in the Coalition Evaluation free webinar series, and thank you so much for joining. We're really excited about the attendance and the interest today, and the topic is overcoming resistance to participatory evaluation, identifying and addressing stakeholder concerns. So I believe all of you should be able to see what's on the screen. So first I wanted to just introduce myself. My name is Andrea De La Flor, and I am joined as always by Dr. Bill Geary, and together we have an evaluation consulting company called Global Evaluation Solutions, which sponsors these free monthly webinars, and they began last April and they've since been growing in popularity, so we're really excited about that. So let's talk about what we're going to cover today. This is our agenda. All of you should have received this in the description, but we're just doing an introduction to the webinar today and sort of why we decided to do this particular webinar. We're going to be covering the benefits of participatory evaluation, which we have talked about a little bit in the past. This is something that we've been really promoting. Also, the benefits of organizational conflict. I know conflict sounds negative, but there's a lot of information, research out there to tell us that it can actually be quite beneficial if managed properly. We're also going to cover some of the research regarding organizational change, some of the information about individuals and the kinds of things that organizations and individuals might resist when you're trying to create systems changes and changes in processes, which is what is going to happen as you try to move toward a more participatory evaluation kind of approach. And we're going to be talking about how you manage conflict, how you take a look at your own ways of managing conflict that could then build some capacity for your group and help your group manage conflict. And then we're going to kind of wrap it all up with some next steps. We always provide tools and resources on these webinars. It's very important to us that you can take something back to your organization. And so hopefully all of you can have access to the handouts. There's a little section in the control panel. And for those of you that will be listening to this recording in the future, we'll make sure to have access on our upcoming website to these worksheets. But you should see 4 things. There's a conflict styles assessment, there's a planning worksheet, there's a stakeholders concerns worksheet, and some information on participatory evaluation in general. So before we get into sort of this content, we wanted to mention, again, the fact that our last webinar really built off, this webinar really builds off of our last webinar, which was called Assessing Your Capacity for Evaluation Participation. Where are you and where do you want to go? This one really builds off particularly the concepts around the fact that the more you do participatory evaluation, the more people you get involved, the higher likelihood, well, there are many benefits of it, the higher likelihood that you're also going to engage in some differences amongst the group that you're going to have to work through. So I do want to say that if you didn't get to attend that webinar, we're going to be soon announcing a repeat for that one, since we were unfortunately unable to record it and post it on our YouTube channel, but we'll send that out to you. So again, we spoke about the benefits of participatory evaluation, and there are many of them. So just to go over them, having a participatory evaluation approach involving more people in participatory evaluation means that the work that you do is going to be more relevant to your organization. Therefore, it's really going to increase your group's performance and ability to accurately monitor what you do and make changes as necessary in real time. Participatory evaluation builds empowerment, group empowerment, because rather than sort of having everything led by just the evaluator, sort of held in the realm of the evaluator, you are really bringing everyone into the process and doing things that they maybe normally didn't take a part in or didn't even realize that they had the skills to do that. And of course, that goes hand in hand with capacity building. Participatory evaluation is about building your group's internal capacity to do evaluation, even if it is guided by a professional evaluator who can support that capacity building and even monitor and assess sort of the how well your coalition is increasing its capacity throughout the evaluation process over time. There's a lot of development that takes place, leadership development around using participatory evaluation approaches and the development of teams to solve problems together, which is really goes hand in hand with what we're going to be talking about today. And of course, participatory evaluation means that as your coalition, your group develops these skills over time, you can do these things on your own without the heavy reliance of an external evaluator. And of course, I know that most of you are coalitions and you're always thinking about what's going to happen when the money runs out and you don't have $10,000 to spend on evaluation, for example. One of the key reference pieces for that prior webinar was what you see here, which we also provided in a PDF. It's from this Policy and Practice journal. It provided a nice overview of participatory evaluation, and in it, again, they mentioned that while there are many benefits, there are also some conflicts, which I've mentioned, this concept that can occur when you bring groups together to create new ways to collaborate and think about evaluation that's really different from the traditional approach. I think that most people that you'll find are used to and really understand. So just to kind of sum it up here, I'm going to go ahead and read this, summing up this idea of conflict, which is really the topic for today. But participatory evaluations require planning for conflict resolution among the individuals involved. Conflicts can arise because of cultural, language, class, and other differences that exist among and within groups. These conflicts can hinder the successful teamwork required for participatory evaluation. So decision-making and conflict resolution processes have to be established and used on an ongoing basis. Really, there's two important questions to address: who will make decisions and how will the group address conflict? And that is what we're going to share with you today. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Bill, who's going to be talking about how we went into the research on organizational conflict. And while it's vast, there are really some important themes he's going to share with you today. So why don't you go ahead and take it away, Bill?
Okay. Well, hi, everybody. Now I get to sit in the magic chair. Welcome. And before we get started on the research on organizational conflict, I just wanted to have folks, if you could just take like 30 seconds, I know dead air is a death knell, but if you could just take 30 seconds and maybe type in the chat box what interests you about this topic. So if folks could just put in the chat box what interests them about the topics, and I know that not everyone, which means no one else, can see them, but I'll try to read them off as we go through. Great, thank you, everybody. So I'll start reading some of these off, and as they're coming in, a lot of folks, how to increase participation, how to keep coalition members motivated and engaged, understanding how this type of evaluation can help us engage. Sorry, I'm just picking, I'll pick on Debbie's too. Hi, Debbie. Engaging our partners in the evaluation. I see a lot of familiar names, so that's always a good thing. Dealing with different personalities. Yes, that's pretty important. I feel like our coalition should be doing more evaluation, so I wanted to learn more about it. Okay. I'm just randomly picking stuff. Methods of resolving personality-based conflict. Somebody said that they're in transition, looking to change our board makeup. Okay, this should be interesting for you then. Looking to engage disparate communities in health conversations and what can be done, what can be proactive. Good. In fact, we have proactive written in there. Great. Thank you, everybody, for putting all that in. The place that I want to start our conversation is just a quick conversation about the research in organizational conflict as it stands, right? What do we know about organizational conflict? And then we're going to kind of move forward to some research addressing both organizational issues that may lead to what we call resistance of change. So if some of you are familiar with organizational research, you know that there are certain things within an organization that can lead to more conflict, or at least make conflict easier to maintain. But evaluation is the same thing. There's actually stuff in the research that talks about some of the resistance to evaluation and being a part of an evaluation. So we're going to start first with just organizational research on organizational conflict. And what we find is that everyone generally agrees that conflict in an organization, and if you're working in an organization, I don't have to tell you this, but of course conflict is inevitable, right? Just as it is in any relationship. So one of the things that's important about this work is that coalitions often define conflict in negative terms, as Andrea said. So we have to define it as something that's inevitable. We have to define it as something that's a natural part of the growth of the organization. And we have to define it as something that can be healthy, excuse me, in terms of how we do it. So it's the managing, excuse me, goodness, I haven't had this problem all day. It's the managing of the conflict that matters the most, right? How do we do that? Some other things that we should know is that there are benefits to conflict, right? So conflict is not just a negative thing. Some of the benefits that has been recognized in the research about organizational conflict includes increased levels, excuse me, of innovation, team cohesion, bringing the team closer together in a problem-solving model, healthy risk-taking, that is to say, risk-taking where people accept accountability and responsibility for what they're doing. Healthy risk-taking allows the organization to grow further. Fostering team relationships. And then, of course, increased problem-solving abilities, because that's what conflict usually comes down to, is the ability to solve problems as they come up. So when we look at the research, we find that there are two basic elements that we're going to talk about today. One is what we refer to as organizational change. We'll talk about some of the elements, both psychological and institutional, that may lead to resistance in an organization when an organization wants to change something up. And as we said, evaluation. Those two elements combine to what we refer to as resistance to participatory evaluation. So let's start thinking about what we can do to plan to have an organization that makes conflict easier to manage. And so when we're thinking about shifting to a participatory model, or maybe if you're starting from scratch and using a participatory model from scratch, we want to plan not just for the evaluation piece, which is who's going to do what by when and what stuff we're going to collect, what are our indicators going to be, how are we going to report it, all that stuff. But we also want to build into the model how we're going to relate to conflict that may come up when we're asking questions about the evaluation. So the first step, I think, in this that is important is that we provide conflict management training to all members, right? This will make managing conflict easier, basically because it puts everybody on the same page in terms of how conflict should be managed. I think that that's a good idea anyway, because conflicts are going to come up in all of your coalition work, and there is research out there that we came across researching this webinar that points to the importance of having a good conflict resolution methodology built into your work. The next step is identifying potential resistors. So this is part of the planning process. Sitting down with those key stakeholders that you have in the organization and thinking about, all right, if we shift what we do or how we do business, who are the folks that might offer some kind of resistance? And of course, why would they offer resistance becomes very important. And then finally, we want to engage key stakeholders in the very beginning because we're going to need them to help move us through this transition from one method of doing an evaluation to a participatory evaluation. This is true even if you're trying to, I know some of you said you were trying to get more involvement. This is true whether you're using what we have defined in other webinars as a traditional approach where an evaluator basically takes control of the entire evaluation and that there's very little involvement. But it's also true if you already have a level of involvement, but you just want it to be higher, right? That's an organizational change as well. So you will want to engage key stakeholders. And when we say key stakeholders, of course, we're referring to stakeholders that basically people trust, right? People will listen to. Engaging key stakeholders becomes an important piece of this puzzle in terms of the planning. Now, what we've done is we've summarized the research on both organizational change and resistance to evaluation in this worksheet, which is one of the sheets that we've attached. And I don't see the list, sorry, of the sheets that I've attached, so I'm not sure. Oh, there it is. Yes, Andrew just pointed to the screen. So it would be the October 11th webinar, identifying stakeholder concerns worksheet. So this section might be a little bit easier. We're going to zero in on this because I know it's hard to read from here, but it might be easier if you pulled it up on your screen. So let's get started talking about this summary of the research and what you should do. So let's take a look at what we have here. So we're going to use this worksheet to identify possible resistance factors, right? So on the left-hand side, left column, we have the resistance factor. On the right, we have an opportunity for encouragement, right? Which is basically your response. How are you going to handle this? And as you can see, there are 6, if I can count, starting with self-interest, then status impact, loss of control, fear that chaos will accompany change, destabilization, bureaucratic dissonance, and values dissonance, right? And so we define what each of those are, and then we present kind of what we call the opportunity for encouragement, basically summarizing what the research says in terms of what do you do about it if this is the primary issue. Now, it is important to remember that, none of us live in a bubble, right? And that probably fears of organizational change may involve more than one of these. I think the point is to start having conversations with folks about what their concerns are. Certainly, we can take a stab at guessing what their concerns are going to be, but we certainly want them to be a part of the initial assessment conversation in terms of assessing what it is that they're concerned with so that we can then develop a strategy for helping them. So, for example, self-interest. Within an organization, everybody gets certain benefits, right? We adapt to organizational styles, modes of operation, and we learn to derive some kind of benefit from the fact that the system works the way it does. So one of the things that people might be afraid of, either, by the way, they're aware that they're afraid of it, and sometimes they're not aware that they're afraid of it, is this idea that whatever benefits I derive from the current system, If you change the current system, I'm no longer going to get those benefits. And the easiest, I think the easiest example of that is if, for example, a company is going to reorganize their decision-making processes, right? So maybe part of my self-interest is that I was a lead decision maker, so I was able to operate relatively autonomously. I didn't have to answer to a lot of folks. And maybe if you change that style now of decision making so that it's flatter, now all of a sudden I lose some autonomy, right? So I have a self-interest in maintaining my autonomy in the organization. I do want to say at this point, because I know that this got, I think, relatively deep relatively quickly. If folks have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and I will try to keep up with that as we keep moving forward. So status impact then would be the second one. I'm not going to go over all of these. I will go over all the ones for evaluation, but status impact, fear that the status within the group will decrease, right? This is a big one. So again, if I'm involved in a relatively autonomous small group that makes decisions, and I'm one of those folks, I may take a lot of pride in that, right? I may be able to view myself and think that others view me as an expert. And so suddenly, if you're going to use a flatter organizational structure, which certainly is what participatory evaluation calls for, if you're going to use a flatter structure, there's going to be more conversation about things. My expertise may seem a little lower than it was before, right? So keeping these things in mind, and I think we all fear the loss of control, which is the third one. So some of the things that we would do about it, right, under the self-interest, clarify the benefits of the new system, and demonstrate how many of the benefits that folks are currently have from the system that exists aren't going to go away, right? That would be an important one. For status impact, show how the change will either improve or maintain the person's perceived self-worth and status within the group, right? So each of these has an explanation. So let's move on to the evaluation piece then. We know that there's also factors pertaining to evaluation that create resistance. This resistance is not just resistance of being in a participatory evaluation. Some of these are also just about evaluation in general, that there are feelings about evaluation that may hinder progress in the evaluation. So let's talk about these. Negative evaluation experience is one. I think that if you're an evaluator on the line, you've probably come across this. In fact, one of my first jobs as an evaluator, when I was evaluating work at the police department, it's actually in Abington, Pennsylvania, there were concerns about my coming in as an evaluator. I was evaluating their youth programs, the things that they were doing, and they had previous evaluations done in those programs, but many of the officers were not satisfied, especially the sergeant that ran the community policing division at the time. So what he did is, he sat down and he had that conversation with me, and I thought it was very important that I talk to him about those experiences, and that's what we say for the opportunity for encouragement, right? If you've had a prior negative evaluation experience, it's hard to recover from that if you don't put it out front and talk about it. So I listened to him speak about his concerns, and his concerns for the evaluation were that he thought that the evaluator was not as engaged with the department as they should have been, that the evaluator was not responding quickly to requests from them, and that the reporting was not really helping the department move forward, right? And I've heard a lot of these similar kinds of things in my work at CADCA, right? When I was, especially as a TA manager, where people would be talking about their evaluation, and sometimes they were kind of frustrated with how that was working. And those were they're the most common ones, I think. So it was important for me to have a conversation with him and say, yes, that's right. That's bad evaluation. If they're not involved, they do work for you. The reports should be utility focused. That is, they should be useful for you. And let's talk about how we can make sure that that doesn't happen in this case, right? So in this case, it was just making sure in the contract and assuring them that I was going to go beyond what their previous experience was, that this wasn't the same as that. A high commitment to our current process is also something that we can run into, right? Which is to say that the stakeholders strongly identify and defend the current theory of change. So you've spent a lot of time and a lot of resources putting together this theory of change, what leads to what, and then what the solution is going to be. And then there might be some concern that an evaluation might move against some of that work, right? Might point out to folks that some of that work wasn't accurate, I guess, for some reason, whatever it was, that the assumptions that were drawn when the theory of change was created were not correct. And so what do we do about that, right? I know that sometimes we learn systems of solving problems, and those systems can become, to some folks, they can become very emotionally attached to those systems. Um, and what happens is if the evaluation starts to undermine the system as being effective, people can take that personally, right? And I've run into that. I've run into that primarily with drug-free communities grantees um, who spend a lot of time and effort developing logic models. They invest a lot of themselves in that. Um, and it's difficult for them sometimes to hear that maybe a local condition that they came up with wasn't accurate or wasn't specific, identifiable, or actionable enough, maybe some of the indicators that they had. So it's important to focus on the positive outcomes over the importance of defending the theory of change, right? Because what I like to do in those cases is remind folks we're here to serve the community, or we're here to serve the client, whoever that happens to be. If you are an evaluator listening in, if you're a coalition person, we're here to make the community a better place. And if that means that we have to kind of rethink our theory of change, I think what's most important is that we're effective. So let's focus on being effective. And let's also understand that even when things are not turning out the way we think they're going to turn out, there are things that we can learn from that, right? Improving the safety of the community and the skills of the coalition members are the most important things. So we can do that under various models of change. The third one is a big one that I run into, perceived lack of skills. And for some reason, the word always comes up, same word always comes up all the time. And that word is statistics, right? Everybody talks about, I don't have the statistical background. I don't have the statistical knowledge. I don't have all that. Hopefully, if you've been paying attention to our webinar series, including some of the shorter training videos you have, it's not rocket science in the sense that you don't have to be highly adept at statistics to do this kind of work. It helps the deeper your understanding is, but it's not necessary. And they are skills, these math skills in terms of how you develop um, correlations and things like that, they can be developed, particularly if you're working with someone who understands them and they can pass along those skills to you, right? Which is what participatory evaluation is all about. But the other thing that we should be aware of is that process is very important. That is to say, and we're going to talk about this more in a moment, but the skills for evaluation don't just fall under the numbers. It also falls under the processes of knowing and understanding validity, reliability, those kinds of things are critically important. So it's important to meet folks where they're at. I never ask anybody to step outside their comfort zone, or if I do talk to them about stepping outside their comfort zone, it's because they have chosen to do that, right? So maybe I have worked with folks who go, well, I'm not really that good with math, but that's the perfect opportunity for me to work with you and learn some of the skills that you have, right? So I practice a participatory model where I pass those skills along, and sometimes people do want to stretch a little bit. But I never ask them to, and I certainly would never force them to or expect them to do that. I think it is important to have a clear plan for their development of skills if they want to have more of them. So you write those down and you have a development plan. For those of you who are in the teaching profession or have been, right? You understand that part. And then the last one is building in those milestones because we do expect skills to increase over time. And if we want to keep people engaged, we have to show them how far they've come, right? So that's a pretty standard lesson that most of you are familiar with. Excessive fear of negative outcomes is the fourth factor that may lead to resistance. Notice the first word, it says excessive fear, because I think we all at some point fear negative outcomes. I know I do. And it's the potential that the evaluation will uncover negative outcomes. That is to say, again, kind of related to this model of change idea. But suppose, for example, that it turns out that you're not increasing your capacity to the level that you wanted to, or maybe going the opposite direction, or that you're not getting the outcomes that you thought you were going to get, that it looks like things are getting worse instead of better, right? And I think we all have a fear of that. I know I've talked to a lot, again, of grantees, both, for example, strategic prevention grantees and drug-free communities grantees. I find that this is less when I do work with police departments, with probation, parole. They seem to be less concerned about this. But if you have one primary funding source and there's a lot riding on that funding source, there's, I think, a general feeling that you want to please them. So there's some fear that if the numbers don't come back the right way, that you're going to lose the funding, right? I've never seen that happen, to be honest. I've been doing this for 17 years. I've never seen somebody have their funding pulled just because the numbers aren't turning out the way they hoped they would. I have seen folks lose their funding because they engage in bad practices and processes. But I've never seen, as long as you're engaging in good practices and processes, the numbers are what the numbers are. And they provide for you a way of learning and moving forward. And that's what I would focus on, right? That the fact that the numbers didn't turn out the way you thought they were is a fantastic opportunity to learn, ask important questions about why you think that happened, and then make adjustments as you go along. Part of the negative outcomes piece for me also, which isn't listed here, but I would definitely encourage, is monitoring, right? The monitoring aspect of evaluation, where you tell folks that, look, I'm not going to give you a report once a year so that when you look at that report and you see the negative outcome, you're completely shocked by it and surprised. We're going to be working on this together and reporting out regularly. So we're going to know when that's happening, and we're going to see it happening early enough that we'll be able to make adjustments as we go, right? So it's important that you do that. The next element is trust, of course, and I hear this a lot. In fact, I just heard it fairly recently, that the belief that internal evaluation is untrustworthy, that somehow there's something magical about having a third party who's not involved at all with the coalition doing the evaluation. And so this is when I maybe disappoint or shock a few people, but you should know that the research is very clear that does not happen, okay? It does not happen. You do not need a third outside party. And I refer to that as kind of a myth, right? Because there's no guarantee that a third party who's not involved in the coalition, except in the evaluation piece, is actually any better at doing an evaluation. There is no research that shows that, quite frankly. What matters the most are the processes and practices of evaluation that you've built in, right? So we did a webinar on this a few months back in terms of trustworthiness of the evaluator and how that works. And that's one of the elements, right? Do people believe in the process? Are you building into your evaluation checks and balances so that people can see what you're doing? I find that sometimes when people hire a third-party evaluator as an outsider, there's actually more hidden things going on there than there are in participatory models. That you ask typical coalition members why this piece of data was collected instead of another piece of data, they have no idea. And that decreases trustworthiness of the evaluation. So when you come up with these findings, there are people who can still question them because they were not a part of creating those things. So processes and practice is very important. This is why early on, if you're going to shift to a participatory model, it's good to have someone who can work with you hands-on in terms of the good practices and processes, which is why our webinar series way back in March started with the Joint Committee on Educational Standards Practices, right? Because I think the most important place to start an evaluation is making sure that your design is solid, okay? And the other skill sets are more easily trained, right, by doing that. So we certainly will explain the benefits of the community level participatory evaluation to folks, which is why we wanted to cover, this is where we were last time, and we wanted to make that participatory evaluation info sheet one of your handouts, so you could use that to talk to folks about the importance of participatory evaluation and emphasize the skills and trustworthiness of the evaluation leadership and the process. Something that's really important in here is the concept of meta evaluation, which we've talked about on 2 previous webinars, and that's merely the, for those of you who weren't there, that's the ability to have outsiders look at your processes and practices around evaluation. That becomes a critical component to trustworthiness. And then role clarity. I might have skills, and maybe I trust the process, and maybe I understand that negative outcomes can happen and that we can learn from all of that. But it's also possible that if you're going to shift how you do evaluation, I may not understand initially what my role is in that. What am I supposed to do? If I'm already busy, as some of you, if you're involved in coalition work, and I find this is less true than if I'm, the stuff that I've evaluated for schools and police departments, all that, those types of public agencies, it doesn't happen as much, but certainly in public health work, you end up, a lot of coalitions end up with just a handful of people that do a ton of work all the time. And so the big challenge is, how do we disperse that work amongst more folks, right? That handful of people, one of those handful of people may think, hey, gosh, I'd really like to get involved in participatory evaluation, but I can't do more than what I'm doing right now, time-wise. Like, I can't commit anything else. So some of it is being able to sit down and negotiate roles. The other thing that I would offer, because a few people did ask, how do you get people more involved? I'm here to learn how to get people more involved, all of that. One of the key, I think, selling points of participatory evaluation from a member standpoint is that evaluation involves a lot of skills that are very helpful in most people's jobs, even in their home life, in terms of problem solving, in terms of assessing things. So it's a great selling opportunity, I think, to tell folks that they'll be able to gain skills. This is particularly true for youth, I think, because it's things that they can put down on their college applications if they're doing that, or their job applications. They can say, hey, I was involved in this project. We had to, we did interviews with people. We looked for indicators. All of those types of skills are really helpful, I think, especially professionally. So it's a good sell there. And so that role clarity becomes part of that. What do you want to know? How can we get you there? And let's make sure that you have the time that you'll be able to do that. And then down at the bottom of this, we, of course, we always cite our sources. So we put the 2 sources. The first source talked about the Trader Lee 2001 was the organizational stuff, and then the other one was the evaluation stuff. So let's move forward from there. All right, so how do you begin this process then? Well, we developed a very simple worksheet. Most of you probably would have designed it on your own. It looks just like this. And it's just the usual kind of, how do we do this thing, right? Who might resist the change? We sit down with a couple of people, make a list. We think about what their resistance factors might be, right? We then align that with the solutions that are listed on the previous sheet. And then we think, who else can we help? Who else can we get to help us on this, right? Because maybe I'm not the right person, or no one sitting at the table is the right person to help address that person's concerns. So for example, I know that when I was involved in the early years of drop boxes for prescription drugs, that there were a lot of concerns by police, especially regarding the security of these, right? Like, where can you put them? How do you manage and control the stuff that's put in there? And so what we did in Bucks County, PA, right, the coalition I worked for then, a long time ago, got police chiefs who were on board in the local community to talk to other police chiefs, right? So how can we get you more involved? The same thing would be true for evaluation, right? Participatory evaluation. Look for folks who have similar interests, who may feel the similar kinds of resistance, and have them do some of that work in convincing folks. So once this sheet is filled out, you then have a good opportunity to talk to the folks who might be resistors, ask them these questions about where their resistance comes from, and then develop a plan from there. So hopefully this worksheet will help you get there, right? But the next step of this then is, that's all planning, right? So we can plan for how we're going to create a system where we hopefully decrease the amount of conflict that there is. However, conflict is going to be inevitable, as we said. And so even within a system where conflict is minimal, when we start doing things and we have people making more decisions, there's going to be the chance of greater conflict. So let's talk about some steps then to conflict resolution that may not be something that you can plan for. So when the plan doesn't exactly work perfectly, right? So the first step for that is preparing for resolution. We're going to talk about each of these in greater detail in a minute. Sorry, shuffling some papers. Understanding the situation is an important step that we'll discuss. Reaching some type of agreement, of course, is the third one. And then the last one that we're going to talk about is this idea of personal conflict resolution styles. And what do you bring into the room with you when you're engaging in conflict, right? So we're asking folks to do all these things about steps to group resolution, but what about individuals? We're going to talk about that last. So first, let's talk a little bit about how do you prepare a group for resolving conflicts. And there are 4 basic steps to being able to do that. The first one is a critical one. If I could put if I had a little highlighter or whatever and could highlight it right now, if you were all standing in front of me, I would be doing that, because what we find is the initial step of acknowledging that the conflict exists is critically important to successfully managing it. I know that sounds kind of obvious, but believe it or not, the research is also clear that organizations have trouble acknowledging conflict sometimes for a whole host of reasons. And what happens eventually, of course, is that conflict then either does one of 2 things. It either grows, and then that conflict interferes with the processes of the organization, or it gets shifted somewhere else so that the conflict emerges as something different than it started as. Either way, it's something that kind of shuts down business for a while, right? It makes it harder to do business. So acknowledging the conflict and acknowledging the fact that we can have normal, healthy debate, right? And that we can thrive as an organization in the acknowledgement of conflict. We then want to discuss the impact that the conflict is going to have on team dynamics and performance, because we want to know what's at stake with this conflict, right? We are then going to agree to a cooperative process, resolve that we will use a cooperative process as a group. This means putting the team first, may involve setting aside your opinion or ideas, at least for the time being, right? If someone wants to win more than they want to resolve the conflict, you will probably, as an organization, find yourself at a stalemate there, and you will have to have conversations about what to do about that. So it's important that everyone is on board and agrees that, yes, we actually do want to resolve this and that we are going to do that. We also have to agree to communicate, right, in an open way. The suggested communication method usually is some type of active listening technique. So if you're not familiar with those, it would probably be good to familiarize yourself with them. And of course, the usual communication skills that are involved here, which are, no name calling, right? Isolate the problem, those kinds of things. So first we want to prepare for the resolution by acknowledging the conflict, discussing the impact, resolving to engage in a cooperative process, and then agreeing to communicate. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to understand the situation, because we need to be able to frame what it is that we're going to be talking about. And in order to do that, obviously, that framing requires first that you clarify exactly what the position is, right? Whether there are obvious factions within the team who support a particular option, maybe approach or idea. Each team member, each person in the organization or the coalition will hold their own unique view, and it's important to clearly identify and articulate what these are, right? The next thing we want to do is be able to list facts, assumptions, and beliefs. And we're still doing this in the larger group, by the way. List facts, assumptions, and beliefs underlying each position, right? What does each group or person that has a stand believe? What do they value? What information are they using to draw their conclusions? The importance of this step is that you're now teasing apart the fact, assumption, or belief from the person who holds it, right? None of us, through osmosis, suddenly has clarity. We all work with, right, bounded information, bounded rationality. We get our facts and our assumptions and beliefs from somewhere. And so it's important to have a conversation about that. Where are we getting all this stuff from, right? So we're going to talk about that and list them as those things. We're going to list facts, assumptions, beliefs. Don't get caught up in this idea of the fact versus belief thing. This is where having everyone trained in conflict resolution in advance helps, because that's part of the mediation process. But try not to get too hung up on those if you can, because it obviously will slow down your progress. You may have to work with folks individually so that at least there's some level of agreement there up front, right? And of course, the other thing that it does is it really helps clarify everyone's position so that others who may strongly disagree will at least see where a person is coming from. They still don't have to agree with them, but at least they know where they're coming from. Sometimes in conflicts, one of the damaging things is that people don't understand where the other person is coming from and what they're using. This analysis, then analyzing in smaller groups becomes the next step. I would recommend, based on some of the stuff I've read that and certainly experienced, is that groups of 3, maybe 4 tops are best for this. We find that if it's 2, people can feel a little uncomfortable because it might seem a little adversarial. If it's more than 4 or 5, it's easy for people to just not say anything and just to sit back. We want everybody involved in this process, number 1. Number 2, we want to make sure that we have a wide scope of ideas within each group. So don't just randomly choose how groups are going to break out. Pick people to be in groups based on their ideas, beliefs, their stand on this particular, whatever the issue is, right? So that as many people's views are represented in every group as possible, right? And there are some psychological reasons for that too, in terms of people's willingness to cooperate with each other. Then we're going to reconvene once we analyze the situation, kind of flesh out the ideas, look for potential solutions. We're going to reconvene, and then every group's going to report out, and they're going to talk about what were the potential solutions, or were there any aha moments in there. And the last step then is when the larger group reaches some type of agreement. And again, this is where your skills as a facilitator come into play. If you're an evaluator, you're probably familiar with these. Certainly if you're a coalition coordinator, you're aware of these, but there are different ways to reach agreement as a group, right? So thinking about what the best way to reach agreement is for your group is important at that step. So then the last step here is understanding your own conflict style. What is it that when you're having these small group discussions, what is it that you're going to bring to the table? Because we find that that's critically important. And we certainly would, even if you don't train your organization in conflict management, at least at least give them this assessment because it will provide a lot of room for great discussion. And this is where I sign off and cut you loose a little bit. Again, if you have questions as we go forward, I'm going to hand it over to Andrea to talk about understanding your own conflict style. So, Andrea, take it away.
Okay, so again, when we come together as a group, we're always bringing different styles to the table. And there are a lot of tools out there that you can use to really understand how you would approach a conflict situation. We actually really liked this one that was created by the United States Institute of Peace, their Global Peace Building Center, which actually works to prevent and resolve conflicts throughout the world. So they really pointed out that each of us might use different ways to manage conflict, really depending on our situation, but we'll pretty much find that we favor certain approaches. And this is something that we also provide to you in a PDF document, so you should have access to it. So this is what you're looking at right now is the first page of what they call their conflict styles assessment. Basically, they talk about 5 different conflict styles. They are competitor, problem solver, compromiser, avoider, and accommodator. I'm not going to go into the definition of each one because you actually have that in your resource, but you'll see that as you read through the document and the description on how to use it, there's a real understanding that each style has its own advantages and limitations. And it's just really important that we know that it's important to understand and assess our own conflict style, but also the styles of others in our group that we're working to resolve conflict together. So I'm just going to kind of walk through this a bit so you have a better sense for how to complete it. But they say that you really want to, as you go to complete this, you want to think about a conflict that you've experienced in the past and really answer that in mind. So all of you are familiar with taking surveys like this, but keeping a certain conflict in mind. And there's 30 questions. So they say you want to choose an answer that really most closely reflects how you would respond in the conflict situation that you're thinking of. And then I think it's really best to give yourself, you're going to want to give yourself a score of 1 next to each of the selections for each question. Because at the end, you're looking at what you prefer as your most common tendencies around the conflict styles, and each answer you'll see responds to a different conflict style. This will all make sense as you go through it, but yourself. But I wanted to walk through it a little bit. You're looking now at the answer key. And so this is something that after you finish shaking it, you'll want to refer to this answer key here, which basically shows you how you can see each of the conflict styles, the 5 styles are listed next to the responses. So you can see that every time you mark a certain response, it's corresponding to a conflict style. And they say you're going to end up with a score from 0 to 12 for each conflict style. And they do provide a range that tells you that if you use that style frequently, sometimes, or if you don't use it very often. And again, here is what you have also, which is a detailed explanation of each of the conflict styles, which really includes strengths and, again, potential weaknesses. So this really is a way of learning more about what you as an individual bring into the mix, and you probably want to consider using it with some of those that you're working closely with, because it will really promote an understanding of just each other and where everyone is coming from, so that when the conflict does occur, everyone can just be more accepting of differences, because really you're looking to pursue a mutually beneficial and agreeable outcome for everyone. I also wanted to point out here that this resource comes from the Institute of Peace website. So if you just Google it, you'll see that this paper-based resource assessment is actually in an online format there on the website, and they'll help tabulate your responses for you. So that might be a little bit easier. we have these little check marks here, but I think that you might want to put a 1 next to each to make it easier for you to add everything up at the end. Okay, so I'm going to kind of bring it home for us. We talked about a lot today. Bill provided a lot of information. We do on these webinars, and they're short because we don't want to take up too much of your time, but there's always so much that we want to share with you. We want to kind of just wrap it up and make sure that before you go back to your work today, you can really bring it all together in your mind and think about how you might use some of the information and the tools we provided as you move forward. So we just have kind of a recap here of the agenda, which I already brought up in the beginning, but to kind of go over it, we had that introduction of the webinar. We talked about all the benefits for participatory evaluation. We didn't go into a lot of detail, but again, there is a tool, a sheet that we provided, the participatory evaluation information sheet, that we just think is a really nice, easy read. There's so much information out there on participatory evaluation. It's a little bit overwhelming, but if you're new to it, which I know I could see from some of the responses earlier, there are a lot of people that are just kind of trying to learn more about what it is, and I suggest that you take a look there first. Of course, we talked about the fact that the more people you bring into the mix to do anything, and the more kind of systems that you're trying to change, processes, embedded processes, and working with individuals that have different sort of things at stake, you're gonna probably run into a little bit more conflict. And so it's good. It can be very beneficial, and we talked about that if. And that's to highlight really if it's managed appropriately. And so we really gave you some tools to think about the kinds of, I guess, triggers or points of friction that you might encounter in general when you're experiencing a conflict situation. And also we provided you some that are more specific to trying to engage in more participatory evaluation, the kinds of things that people might be more likely, Bill talked about all of his experience, that people are more likely to be concerned about. And we provided you with some ideas on that reference sheet that you could use to really brainstorm just ways that you might address some of those issues for people. And so that is a way that you can sort of just start thinking about it. We provided you with that planning document as well, to kind of really work through with some of the folks at your table how it is that you might be able to prepare for this meeting or this conversation that you need to have together. Let's see. So then we provided you with the tool to understand your own sort of approach to conflict. And so really, again, just to sort of recap what we think maybe you could do next, we just think that if you're experiencing a conflict currently, whether that's with evaluation, engaging more in evaluation or otherwise, that it would be useful for you to take a look at that conflict, the Addressing Stakeholders' Concerns worksheet, to really get some people together and prepare using that conflict management planning worksheet, prepare maybe what you're going to do to address the issues, who might be giving you pushback, and then take a look at the skills and sort of the conflict styles and approaches of your group. We want to thank you so much for being on this webinar, and this really wraps it up for today. We hope that it was helpful to you. This is something that we're very passionate about. We spend a lot of time getting this information out to you, but it means a lot to us to be able to do that. I want to ask you to mark your calendars for our next webinar, which will take place on Tuesday, November 15th. That is going to be from 12 to 1:30. This one is a little bit longer because we wanted to provide more time for our expert speakers. We are absolutely thrilled to announce that a veteran researcher, Dr. Mark Goldstein, and his colleagues have actually offered to present to everyone their new research, which hasn't even been published yet. And it really sought to address some of the frustrations that you all are familiar with, and me as a new coalition director as well, of DSC coalitions and what they face around trying to help coalition members understand the roles and the work that the roles that they play and the work that they should be contributing to as members, versus sort of the paid staff, right? We have paid staff are doing, it's just a typical scenario, paid staff are doing all the work, and it's hard to kind of get others to actually do work and not just come to meetings. I personally have not seen much research on this at all. So given the topic, it's a big topic, and it's so exciting. They actually engaged DSC coalitions in this research study. So for those of you who have a DSC grant or are thinking about it, that is going to particularly resonate with you. I can tell you that they found some differences in the perceptions of among the two groups, the staff and the volunteers. In some ways, they agreed upon their roles, but there were some clear places where they did not. And so they're going to be talking about that on the webinar. And I also want to point out that Dr. Goldstein is a professor emeritus in the Department of Psychological Science at Central Connecticut State University. If you want to look him up, he has over 33 years of experience in the field, and he's also an expert in evaluation. And because of the evaluation work that he's so very interested in, he actually is going to be talking about how some of this research applies to potentially evaluators and how evaluators can help build coalition skills and assess their skills in terms of being able to bring more members actively engaged and at the table. We always want you to not only subscribe to our YouTube channel, where we post our recordings, although I'll admit that we're a little bit behind right now, but we're going to be posting our prior webinars up, and also we have brief tip videos, training into practice, if you haven't seen them yet, which is basically trying to take a webinar like this and turn it into a 6-minute kind of video that you can share with anyone. But please, we always tell you to request a webinar topic, to email us, to share a success story. This whole piece with Dr. Goldstein would have never happened had he not decided to join our webinar last month and then reach out to us and tell us about his research. So these are the kinds of collaborations that really make all of this that we're doing exciting and fluid and responsive to your needs. I know as a participant in all of this, it's going to be one of my next steps is to start figuring out who's coming to these sessions a lot and reach out to some of you and ask if you have a success story that you want to share around coalition evaluation, and start having some of you talk about your work and your experience. So again, please feel free to always reach out to us, even just to have a talk. Our emails are right here, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Bill, see if he has anything else to say before we close up. But thank you so much.
Yeah, so will the PowerPoint, sorry, I'm just going to start talking and not provide any context. No, so I was looking over the question window, and someone asked, Debbie asked, will the PowerPoint be available as a printable handout? You know, Debbie, if you let us know, yes, we will do that. What we do is it's actually a Prezi that gets, we'll have to convert it to a PowerPoint and then give it to you like that. But if anybody would like that, we're happy to provide that. If you have any other questions before we're signing off, usually we stay on for 5 minutes or so after we close. Please put them there. If people have written questions in there, because there's a lot of comments in there right now, and sometimes we have difficulty managing multiple screens and picking up on them as they come out, be rest assured that we will provide them for you. And we also provide letters of participation for those of you who are trying to maintain, as I know Andrea does, her ICFS.
CPS.
Thank you, CPS. certification, so we will provide those. Just request that, and we'll be happy to pass that along to you. And thank you, everybody, for participating. Don't forget to join our YouTube channel, because if we get 100 people, we can actually come up with an easy name to remember. You need 100 people to subscribe to your YouTube before you can name it something you want to. Otherwise, you just get all this gobbledygook to get to it. So please feel free to do that. With a combined 27 years of experience in evaluation, we know that this job can get a little crazy. But I always like to remember the words of the Eagles, who sang, "Take it easy. Don't let the sound of your own wheels drive you crazy." Thank you again for your participation. And I'll be handling questions in the chat window. Thanks a lot. And hopefully we'll see you for our big event next month. Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.
Bye. And as I said, I'll be print out. Okay, Chris, absolutely. Yes, we will absolutely. Karen Davis wants to make sure we'll provide the link. We will. We'll be sending out a separate mailing for all of that. And also Debbie Evans already subscribed. Thank you, Karen Davis, for subscribing. And Debbie, it's a pleasure as always. Bye-bye.